as Chuck already mentioned, this is going to be more like a start, an appetizer for something we're going to continue in the next year. It's going to be very brief. As you can see in the title, I picked the topic of the Gokaden, a revisit of the Gokaden. So we're going to go through all the traditions, and we all have read and studied the same books. I'm sure there will not be any new major revelations in this lecture series, but what I'm trying to do is to reintroduce to you the Gokaden, the 5 traditions, in an accessible and engaging way, and clarify the one or other thing. And I'm also happy to answer questions as good as I can. And going forward, this might actually turn into a little workshop rather than a dry lecture series. So before we even start talking about swords, I would like to break down the concept of the Gokaden and how this classification came to be. So what we're talking about. We have here the Gokaden, which, as most of you surely know, means literally 5 traditions. So in other words, I would like to just briefly explain how the Japanese saw their swords, or rather how they classified their swords throughout history. So the term Gokaden itself, it's relatively new, and it was only introduced by Honami Koson in the early 1900s. But I will come to that and his reasoning behind this approach in a minute. So until the late Muromachi period, the sword books are usually structured, or rather unstructured, like this. It starts always with the ancient grandmasters. You have like Sanjo Monechika, Amakuni, Yasutsuna. Then you have a section about famous swords like the Higekiri, the Hisamaro, the Kogarasumaro. Then you have a section about which smith made a sword for a famous emperor. And then you have, of course, the Gobankaji in all of the sword books, the 12 smiths who worked for the retired Emperor Gotoba. And then you have just randomly works from all the provinces. So as you can see, there's no overarching framework in these early sword books. There are some genealogies here and there, but from these early books alone, it doesn't become clear how everything was connected from a technological and stylistical point of view. So this is like the earliest sword book in existence. It's the early Muromachi period, but it is a transcript of Kamakura period sword knowledge. So you can see here on the left side, it's the ancient smiths Yasutsuna, Amakuni, Shinsoku, Gasan, Yukihira. And then you have, like, on the right side, Yamato province, and it just lists names of smiths with very rudimentary information. That's like the early sword books. You have no idea how the styles and everything is connected from that. And it's a map of Japan, and I want to demonstrate this by an example that I always use to point out the difficulties with the old system. So we have here Yamashiro province, and Yamashiro Mono, which can be translated as Yamashiro Works. So you have here, then you have Kamakura Mono, you have Yamato Mono, blades from Yamato province, and then you have Kyushu Mono. And you would have no idea, just by these old books, like also here Bingo Mono, why Kyushu Mono and why Bingo Mono and Yamato Mono are connected. It doesn't get clear just from the listing of the provinces. So you have to dig a little bit, and that's what I try in this series. Why these are connected? Because in the early times, like from the Nara period to the Kamakura period, in Kyushu there was like a major hub for the contact with China, and it was a big military base. So people were constantly going from Kyoto and Yamato down to Kyushu. And this is also how the sword technology spread. And why do Bingo swords, for example, show Yamato characteristics? Is because this is where the whole travelers stopped on the way to Kyushu. So Bingo had a lot of estates owned by the Yamato temples. So they were going down south, they stopped in Bingo for probably a couple of weeks and brought a smith with them, and then they taught the local smiths in Bingo. So that's why we see Yamato characteristics in Bingo and not in neighboring Bisen province, for example. It's just one of the things we have to connect the dots a little bit, which are not clear if you just listen to the old sword books. So by the end of the Muromachi period, however, and throughout the subsequent Momoyama period, so we see a boom in the sophistication of sword knowledge. And this, of course, didn't come out of the blue sky. It is connected to the fact that this was the time through Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu when the renowned families of sword polishers and appraisers like the Honami, Takeya, and Tsuchiya, when they became almost like small competing associations. So by the Momoyama period, they started to really refine their knowledge and put it also into word. And they realized that this old system can't work any longer. It's not comprehensible. So they all come up with their little own systems. So some, for example, they narrowed this the similarity in style down to the ancestors like Sanjo Monechika, Kobisen Tomonari, Kohoki Yasutsuna, Bungo Yukihira, and Dewa Gasan. This was one approach to make to split it up into 5. While others, like the Honami, they were following the major production sites like Bisen, Soshu, and Kamakura, Yamashiro and Kyoto, Yamato, and which is surprising, Kyushu. At that time, in the Momoyama period, Mino was not on the list yet. It was a major production site, of course, but only for 100 years at the time. So it was not considered to be one of the ancient, old established construction sites. So Mino is usually missing at this Momoyama and early Edo lists. So, but we can see the trend to acknowledging that there is a stylistic connection between certain regions of Japan that remains in place for a long period of time. So hence the introduction of the term tradition then. So we have here the Yamashiro Den, the Yamato Den, Bisen Den, Soshu Den, and Mino Den. And let's go back to this guy here. So all this balkanized way of handing down sword information between the polisher and appraiser families is all lasted through the entire Edo period. And it was only until the opening of Japan and for the first time in history that something like a sword as a hobby or a sword as a passion emerged, when now people from all walks of life were able to access swords, and not only the samurai and the upper echelons of society like before. And one of the major players of the time was Honami Kozan, which I've mentioned earlier. It was this guy. He adopted more modern scholastic approaches, and he wrote a ton of articles and a fair number of books. And he was the first to introduce the term of Gokaden, the 5 traditions. So before we start with the first one of the Gokaden, the Yamashiro tradition, so I already talked about that. So I want to talk about, as mentioned, I don't like the rushed approach that everything pops out of the blue sky and it's there, and Yamashiro is there, and it makes Koitame and Suguha. So I always try to give a little introduction how his traditions came into existence. And starting with the Yamashiro tradition, we have to, there's the different ways by which it's referred to. You can Yamashiro Den, Yamashiro Mono, or Kyomono. So we have to, it's on the map, Yamashiro province with Kyoto as its center. If you hear, for example, Yamashiro works or Yamashiro tradition, that basically means Kyoto, because with the exception of very obscure Muromachi period schools like Kuramaseki, there is no other sword production site in Yamashiro than Kyoto. So we have to bear in mind with the emergence of the Yamashiro tradition that back then Kyoto was had a high degree of sophistication in poetry, literature, painting, calligraphy, lacquer, and also swords, of course. For an aristocrat in Kyoto at that time, it would have been inconceivable to look at a crude and an unrefined sword blade. Everything had to be refined and elegant, like from slender shapes over a tightly forged jigane to an unaffected and natural hamon. So this was not the time yet for okisaki monsters with a hitatsura hamon. So this culture, this highly refined culture, was the breeding ground for the emergence of the Yamashiro tradition. But it didn't start out as a tradition per se. The beginning was, and according to tradition, an aristocrat who started to make swords, first for him as a pastime and passion, and later on requests for other courtiers from his circles. And this man was the famous Sanjo Munechika, also called Kokaji. So I want to spare you with too many details because it's going to be just a brief introduction to everything today. But Munechika is traditionally dated to the Heian era, which is the end of the 10th century. And no dated works of Munechika exist, of course, and all the information about him we have about being active around Heian go back to these early sword books, which state that he made a sword for Emperor Ichijo, who reigned from 986 to 1011. So that's the only connection to this era we have. So they say, okay, he made a sword for Ichijo, let's date him around Heian. So it has to be, this traditional date has to be taken with a grain of salt, but it is today nevertheless more or less accepted that he was indeed active in the mid-Heian period. So, and that his works constitute like the earliest form of the indigenous Japanese sword, the Nihonto, which is curved and has a single cutting edge. So to put it in to add another timeline here, he was active about 300 years after the latest straight Chinese style swords in the Shoso-in repository Nara had been made. So these are the Nara blades, date around 600, 700, the straight with a single cutting edge, and Munechika's blade here at the bottom, which dates about 300 years later. There's a lot of, I don't know where this is cut off, but the Kisake should be on the left side. But there's a lot of time between, and this is a whole topic for another lecture, how this all came from the top form to the bottom form. But I want to just go ahead and just introduce a few of the characteristics that we still see with Munechika. As you can see, there's the famous Mikatsuki Munechika, and we have here a scroll, one of the Kansan Scroll out here. You can see the Ojigata in real life, in true to life size. And you can see still the Shinogichi is still noticeably wide, and this is also still a remnant of the early sword forms we see in the Shoso-in. So that's the blade, has two more views, small Kisake and the tang. And interesting is with early Yamashiro, you shouldn't think about the Yamashiro tradition we're gonna learn in next year in one of the first lectures, because they don't have the Yamashiro, the refined Koitame and Shichihara. With Munechika, you often see Itame mixed with some larger Nagare structures, and a lot of going on in the, and not really that uniformity in the Chigane. Here's an Ojigata of the Mikatsuki, and I go into the details in a minute. It's another work of his. It's a Gyobutsu in the Imperial Collection. It has the same kind of activities, which I wanted to point out here. So we have early Kyomono, early Yamashiro, early Sanjo works. They have a very like horizontal hataraki, a very layered approach. You have koashi, you have nichuba, sanjuba. It gives the blade this layered appearance. you have a few Kintsuchi, then Nichuba also go into the Boshi, you have a few Moneyaki, you have a few Tobayaki and Yubashiri, and this all goes back to, at that time, the hardening was not that refined and planned as it was later. So it was all trial and error, and when you harden the blades, you quench it in water, you rather, like if it turns out fine, it's gonna be fine, you know, leave it at that. You don't try to, at that early stages, you don't try to make like a picturesque hamon. If it's like everything uniform and everything turns out it's hardened the whole way through, you're gonna leave it at that and try it the next time the same way. So, and that's like a big discussion that I wanna like come towards the end with what the big issue of the Chigane. You often read in the books that Yamashiro is ko mokume, fine mokume, but I try to go away from this approach, because in most cases it's a form of itame or ko-itame that has mokume only in areas. So if you don't really see these swirls anywhere on a blade, it's safer to go with itame rather than say the blade is based on mokume. Like here I try to point it out. For the blade on top is ko-itame, it has a little bit of, maybe a little bit of ko-mokume and nagare, and at the blade at the bottom you can see a lot of swirls and burls. You can see this is mokume. So I would recommend not focusing too much on the mokume thing. If you read mokume, oh, that's Yamashiro, I would just like be careful and read all the explanations. What is the hada mixed with? That I just try to point out with this first thing here. And also at the time, mid to late Heian, you shouldn't expect that many daggers or kowakisashi. There are not that many extant. This is a famous blade by Munechika. It's called the Ebina Kokaji. It's still up to debate if it's authentic. 80% of experts believe it is, but there's still some doubts that this blade form existed in the mid-Heian period. So I want to wrap it up. What early Yamashiro is constituted, like we have slender and elegant shapes, occasionally with a slightly wider shinogichi. We have a kokisaki and koshisori, which decreases noticeably towards the tip. We do not have a prominently dense hada in early Yamashiro, but which is mixed with nagare in places. We have a suguha-based hamon in ko niedeki or niedeki, and the ha is mixed with smaller komidare elements and ashi, and we have a lot of horizontal and layered hataraki like nichuba, sanjuba, koichigaiba, and kintsuchi, and natural hardening effects in the chi like yubashiri and tobayaki. And also one feature of early Yamashiro is, in general, you should not expect to find tanto or kowakisashi from this era. So as mentioned, this is only just a starter, and I would like to go into more detail and explain a little bit more in a more comprehensive manner about Yamashiro. When we start off with the first part of Yamashiro, which should then be after Sanjo, Monechika, and Gojo schools and Awataguchi. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Otherwise, I'm gonna, yep, Robert.
Markus, what percentage, or have you seen many blades that are Sanjo Munechika that don't have that layered approach, the Nijuba, the Sanjuba? Have you seen works without those characteristics?
I have seen works without the characteristics, but which are doubted as his works. So it goes very much with the workmanship. If the layered hataraki are not there, the doubts raise if it's really a Monechika. Okay. But there's like less than a handful blades that you can really see. I have seen the Mikatsuki. I have seen one Monechika that was signed Sanjo at the Token Taikai, like, I don't know, 13 years ago. But you know, it's like unicorn level. You're not gonna come across a Sanjo Monechika somewhere, like in a Daito Genichi, for example. Okay. Okay, then I'm gonna hand it over to you, Robert. And
Thank you, Markus.
sure.
Maybe you should mention the Kansan Scrolls that
Yeah.
brought in.
Yeah. So the Kansan Scrolls we have here, the early swords, the early sword that I quickly showed, which is the 7th century sword, and then the Mikatsuki Monechika right next to it. And you can take a look, it's all true to size, so you get a feel for how elegant those early blades are. So they are not really massive, you have like a really tiny tip. So please go ahead and then take a look if you have time.